A struggling farmer takes a chance on a sick horse no one wanted, buying him for just pennies. The horse, weak and forgotten, seems destined for nothing more than heartbreak. But years later, in a moment of life or death desperation, this same horse does the unthinkable, saving the farmer's life in a way no one could have imagined. How did this broken horse become a hero? And what will it take to uncover the incredible bond that changed their lives forever? This is a story of hope, courage, and the miracles found in the most unexpected places. Before we get into the story, comment below where in the world you are watching from today. The autumn sun cast long shadows across the auction yard as John Martin shifted his weight from one foot to the other. His weathered hands gripped the small wad of savings in his pocket, money that should have gone toward new farm equipment. But something drew him here today. A feeling he couldn't explain, like a whisper in his heart that wouldn't be ignored. Next up, lot number 47, the auctioneer announced flatly, barely glancing at his clipboard. Red, thoroughbred stallion, as is. Two stable hands led out a copper-colored horse, his ribs visible beneath a dull coat that had lost its shine months ago. The horse's head hung low, but his eyes still held a quiet dignity that caught John's attention immediately. John noticed how the animal moved, careful, deliberate steps that spoke of hidden strength beneath the neglect. Starting bid at $50, the auctioneer continued, his voice carrying a note of dismissal. Horse belongs to Mr. Hastings' stable, but has been deemed unsuitable for racing. Too slow, they say. The crowd stayed silent, some people shifting uncomfortably, others looking away. John's heart beat faster as he raised his hand, fingers trembling slightly. $50. No one challenged his bid. The auctioneer's gavel fell with a sharp crack that echoed through the yard. Sold to the gentleman in the brown jacket. Later that afternoon, John led Red up the dusty driveway to their small farm, talking softly to him the whole way. Claire stood on the porch, worry lines creasing her forehead as she watched her husband approach, her arms crossed tightly against her chest. John, what have you done? She asked softly, but there was warmth in her voice and a hint of understanding in her eyes. He just needs some care, Claire. You'll see. John's eyes sparkled with hope as he patted Red's neck. This horse, he's special. I can feel it. Their daughter Emily sat on the porch steps, her sketchbook open on her lap, colored pencils scattered around her. She looked up from her drawing, her eyes widening at the sight of Red. For a moment, her usual distant expression lifted, replaced by a flash of interest that made John's heart soar. John led Red to the newly cleared stable, talking softly to the horse as he filled the feed bucket with fresh oats. You're home now, boy. We'll get you strong again. Just you wait and see. The peaceful moment shattered when John suddenly gasped, his hand clutching his chest. The feed bucket clattered to the ground as he collapsed, scattering oats across the stable floor. John! Claire's scream pierced the evening air, sending birds scattering from nearby trees. She ran toward the stable, her feet kicking up dust clouds behind her. Someone help! Please, somebody help! 3 years later, Claire stood in that same stable, measuring out a meager portion of hay for Red. The horse's condition had deteriorated since John's death. They both had. His coat had lost its luster again, though his eyes still held that same quiet strength. Bills piled up on the kitchen table, and the bank's foreclosure notices grew more frequent, their threatening language becoming harder to ignore. Emily, now 9, lingered in the stable doorway, her small frame casting a long shadow in the afternoon light. Her father's wooden horse carving was clutched tightly in her small hands, its surface worn smooth from constant handling, the once sharp details softened by years of love. She hadn't spoken much since the funeral, but she spent hours watching Red, her quiet presence a constant in the stable, drawing picture after picture of the horse who seemed to understand her silence. That evening, Claire tucked Emily into bed, smoothing her daughter's hair back from her forehead with gentle fingers. "Sweet dreams, sweetheart," she whispered, receiving only a blank stare in response, though Emily's grip on the wooden horse never loosened. Later, sitting alone at the kitchen table with her cooling tea, Claire gazed out the window into the gathering darkness. Red's dark shape was barely visible in the moonlight, a shadow among shadows. John's last gift to them, a dream of better days, stood in that stable, growing weaker by the day, just like their hopes for the future. She wrapped her hands around the warm mug, drawing comfort from its heat. "I won't let your dream die, John," she whispered into the quiet night. "Somehow, we'll keep him alive. All of us. I promise." The morning dew sparkled on the grass like scattered diamonds as Claire trudged toward the stable, carrying a bucket of cheap feed. Her shoulders and back ached from another restless night spent tossing and turning. Inside the dim stable, Red stood motionless in his stall, his once gleaming copper coat now dulled by poor health and neglect. "Come on, boy," Claire coaxed, pouring the feed into his worn metal trough. "You need to eat something, please." Red turned his head away from the bucket with painful slowness, and Claire's heart sank like a stone. That's when she heard soft footsteps behind her. Emily stood at the stable entrance, her small frame silhouetted against the bright morning light, still wearing her favorite blue pajamas. The girl hadn't left the house this early since John's passing 3 weeks ago. Emily approached slowly, her eyes fixed intently on Red. She stopped a few feet from the stall and began whispering words Claire couldn't quite hear, her voice as soft as rustling leaves. Red's ears twitched forward, and he turned toward Emily's voice, showing more interest than he had in days. The horse lowered his head, reaching toward her through the weathered stall bars. Claire held her breath, hardly daring to move as she watched her daughter reach out tentatively. A tiny smile, the first Claire had seen in weeks, tugged at Emily's lips when Red snorted softly against her palm, his whiskers tickling her skin. Later that morning, while Claire washed breakfast dishes in soapy water, a sudden crash from the living room made her jump and splash water down her front. She rushed in to find Emily standing frozen, staring at the broken wooden horse on the floor, John's last gift to her, now splintered into pieces. Emily's hands flew to her ears as she began pacing back and forth across the worn carpet, her breathing becoming rapid and irregular. "Sweetie, it's okay," Claire said softly, reaching for her daughter with gentle hands. But Emily pulled away sharply, her distress growing stronger with each passing second. A gentle neigh drifted through the open window, clear as a bell. Emily stopped mid-pace, her hands lowering slightly from her ears. Red stood at his stall window, watching the house intently. Without a word, Emily walked outside into the morning sun, leaving Claire to follow in her wake. At the stable, Emily placed her small hand on Red's velvety nose. Her breathing slowed gradually as the horse nuzzled against her palm, his presence steady and calming. Claire watched in amazement as her daughter's shoulders relaxed, the tension melting away like spring frost. That evening, after a quiet dinner of mac and cheese, Claire found Emily in the stable. The girl sat on an overturned bucket, carefully brushing Red's tangled mane with slow, methodical strokes. She hummed softly, a sound Claire hadn't heard since before John's death. Red stood perfectly still, his eyes half closed in contentment, occasionally nickering softly. Claire leaned against the stable door, watching the gentle scene before her. The horse's presence seemed to ground Emily in a way nothing else had since losing her father. Despite their mounting financial struggles, Claire knew she had to find a way to keep Red healthy, not just for John's memory now, but for the sake of Emily's healing heart. Emily continued humming their favorite lullaby, her brushstroke steady and gentle in the fading light. Red's tail swished peacefully, shooing away the evening flies, and in the golden sunset streaming through the barn windows, Claire saw something she'd been desperately missing, a glimmer of hope for tomorrow. Claire's hands trembled slightly as she scrubbed the breakfast dishes. Through the kitchen window, she watched Emily sitting near Red's stall, drawing in her sketchbook. The peaceful morning shattered when a glossy black Mercedes rolled up their gravel driveway, kicking up dust. A tall man in an expensive charcoal suit stepped out, his polished shoes crunching on the gravel. Claire dried her hands on her apron, her stomach tight with worry. As she opened the screen door, Emily darted away from the window like a startled deer. "Mrs. Martin?" The man's voice was smooth as silk, but cold as ice. "I'm Robert Hastings. We need to discuss the horse." Claire crossed her arms. "Red? What about him?" "There seems to be a misunderstanding about his ownership." Hastings adjusted his gold cufflinks. "My assistant never completed the proper transfer of ownership. Legally speaking, Red still belongs to me." "That's not true," Claire said, her voice stronger than she felt. "My husband bought him fair and square at your auction." Hastings smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Did he receive any paperwork? A bill of sale, perhaps?" Claire's silence answered for her. Through the window, she could see Emily peeking out, her face pale with worry. "I thought not," Hastings continued. "I'm here to collect what's mine." Claire stepped off the porch. "Red was sick when John bought him. You were going to put him down. We nursed him back to health. He's part of our family now." "Family?" Hastings scoffed. "He's livestock, Mrs. Martin. Property. And he's my property." They walked toward the barn, where Emily stood in the doorway. Behind her, Red's large frame filled the entrance, his ears pricked forward. The horse's presence seemed almost protective, standing guard behind the small girl. "Look," Claire said, "we may not have paperwork, but we paid for him. He's ours." "Without documentation, you have no claim." Hastings straightened his tie. "I'll be back with proper authorities to collect him." "No," Claire said firmly. "Red stays here. He's helped my daughter more than you could understand." Hastings turned to leave, his smile now cruel. "I always get what's mine, Mrs. Martin. Always." He climbed into his car and drove away, leaving a cloud of dust in his wake. Emily wrapped her arms around Red's neck, burying her face in his mane. Claire watched Hastings' car disappear down the road, her heart heavy with dread. Dust motes danced in the morning sunlight as Claire pulled down another cardboard box from the attic shelves. Her fingers left trails in the thick layer of dust covering the lid. Emily sat cross-legged on the wooden floor nearby, her colored pencils scattered around her as she sketched Red's familiar shape. "There has to be something here," Claire muttered, rifling through old receipts and documents. Bills, birthday cards, and grocery lists filled the box. At the bottom, she found a wrinkled envelope with John's messy handwriting. Her heart jumped as she opened it. Inside was a simple note. "Red, $250 paid cash to Robert Hastings' stable hand." Claire's shoulders slumped. No official receipt, no bill of sale, just John's informal record. Later that afternoon, Claire drove to Meadowbrook Stables, where Henry Lewis worked. The elderly caretaker was brushing down a horse when she arrived, his weathered face breaking into a kind smile. "Claire Martin," he said warmly. "Haven't seen you here in a while." She explained her situation, wringing her hands as she described Hastings' visit and the lack of paperwork. Henry listened carefully, leaning against the stable door. "That's a tough spot," he said, shaking his head. but I might know someone who can help. Daniel Brooks. He's a lawyer in town who's helped quite a few folks around here with similar problems. Good man, fair prices. I don't have much money, Claire admitted. Dan works with people who are struggling, Henry assured her. Let me give him a call. He owes me a favor anyway. When Claire returned home, she found Emily in Red's stall. The girl was humming softly as she ran a brush through the horse's russet coat. Red's eyes were half closed, clearly enjoying the attention. The peaceful scene made Claire's heart ache with determination. She watched her daughter, normally so withdrawn, looking content and focused as she cared for Red. The horse gently nudged Emily's shoulder, making her giggle, a sound Claire hadn't heard in months. The afternoon sun streamed through the barn windows, casting a golden glow over them both. Claire straightened her shoulders, Henry's business card tucked safely in her pocket. She would find a way to keep Red, no matter what it took. Claire's hands trembled slightly as she pushed open the glass door to Daniel Brooks' law office. The small waiting room smelled of coffee and old papers. A tired-looking receptionist directed her to a narrow hallway where she found Daniel's office. The lawyer looked younger than she expected, with kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses. He gestured to a worn leather chair across from his desk. "Mrs. Martin," he said warmly, "Henry told me about your situation. What can you tell me?" Claire pulled out John's note and spread it on the desk along with the few documents she'd gathered. Her voice grew stronger as she explained about Red, Emily's connection with him, and Hastings' threatening visit. Daniel listened carefully, occasionally jotting notes. When she finished, he leaned back in his chair. "I won't sugarcoat this, Mrs. Martin. Without a formal bill of sale, this could be complicated. Mr. Hastings has considerable resources and influence." "But you think we have a chance?" "Yes, but it won't be quick or cheap. We're looking at several $1,000s in legal fees, possibly more if this goes to court." Claire's stomach tightened, but she nodded firmly. "I'll find a way." Back at the farm that afternoon, Claire found Emily in her usual spot by Red's stall. Her daughter sat cross-legged on a hay bale, reading aloud from her favorite picture book about horses. Red stood at attention, his ears pricked forward, looking more alert than he had in weeks. Claire paused in the barn doorway, not wanting to disturb the peaceful scene. Red's coat had a healthier shine, and he was standing steadily instead of leaning against the stall wall. Emily turned a page, her quiet voice steady and clear, a stark contrast to her usual reluctance to speak. That evening, after tucking Emily into bed with a kiss, Claire settled at the kitchen table. She pulled out her bills and switched on an old brass lantern. The electricity had been acting up again, another expense she couldn't afford right now. By lantern light, she made 2 columns in her notebook, income and expenses. The legal fees loomed large in the expense column. Claire chewed her pencil, thinking hard. Mrs. Johnson down the road had mentioned needing help with housekeeping, and Sarah at the church had asked if Claire could make a quilt for her new grandbaby. Claire started a new list. Quilting, $200, housekeeping, 15-hour. She could manage both between farm chores if she started earlier in the mornings. It would be exhausting, but she had no choice. Red wasn't just a horse anymore. He was Emily's lifeline, a connection to the world she'd withdrawn from after losing her father. The morning sun cast long shadows across the town square as Claire arranged her homemade quilts and jam jars on a rickety folding table. The farmer's market buzzed with activity, the air filled with the scent of fresh bread and coffee from nearby stalls. "These quilts are beautiful, Claire," Martha, the baker's wife, said, running her fingers over the intricate stitching. "How are you holding up?" Claire managed a small smile. "Taking it day by day. The legal fees are tough, but we're managing." Word spread quickly through the market about Claire's situation. People stopped by, not just to buy, but to offer encouragement and share their own stories about standing up to bullies like Hastings. Sarah Johnson, a young reporter with bright eyes and a notepad in hand, approached Claire's stall. "Mrs. Martin, I'm from the local paper. Henry Lewis mentioned your story to me." Claire hesitated, but Sarah's genuine interest was apparent. "We need all the support we can get," Claire admitted, telling Sarah about Red's transformation and Emily's special bond with him. Sarah scribbled notes enthusiastically. "This is exactly the kind of story our community needs to hear. Would you mind if I wrote about it? People should know what's happening." "That would mean a lot," Claire said, touched by the offer. Unknown to Claire, a black luxury car idled at the edge of the market. Behind tinted windows, Robert Hastings gripped his steering wheel tightly, watching the scene unfold. His jaw clenched as he observed another customer hugging Claire. Hastings pulled out his phone, jabbing at the screen with manicured fingers. "It's me," he growled when someone answered. "These small-town folks are getting too involved. They need to learn not to cross me. Make sure they get the message." He hung up without waiting for a response. That evening, Claire's arms ached as she carried her unsold items into the house. The market had been successful, but exhausting. After checking on Emily, who was already asleep clutching John's carved horse, Claire headed to the stable for Red's evening check. The moment she opened the stable door, she knew something was wrong. Red paced in his stall, his hooves striking the floor nervously. His usually calm demeanor had been replaced with agitation, his ears pinned back. "Easy, boy," Claire whispered, approaching carefully. Red's nostrils flared as he continued his anxious movement. Something had clearly spooked him. But what? Claire searched the stable, but found nothing out of place. Through the stable window, she could see Emily's bedroom light casting a soft glow. Claire stood there for a long moment, one hand on Red's neck, trying to calm him, while an uneasy feeling settled in her stomach. The midnight air hung still and heavy over the Martin farm. Two dark figures crept across the moonlit yard, their footsteps muffled in the grass. The taller one carried a red gas can, its contents sloshing with each step. "Make it quick," the shorter one whispered, keeping watch. Inside his stall, Red's ears twitched at the unfamiliar voices. He shifted uneasily as the sharp smell of gasoline filled his nostrils. The men worked silently, dousing hay bales near Red's stall. A match struck, its small flame briefly illuminating masked faces. The hay caught quickly, flames leaping hungrily from bale to bale. The men disappeared into the darkness as smoke began to curl upward. Red's panic rose with the flames. He reared up, hooves thundering against his stall door. His frightened whinnies pierced the night, echoing across the farm. Claire bolted upright in bed, heart pounding. Through her window, an orange glow flickered ominously. "The stable!" she gasped, rushing to throw on her boots. Emily appeared in the hallway, eyes wide with fear. "Mom! Red's crying!" "Stay back, Emily. Call Henry next door." Claire grabbed a bucket from the kitchen, running toward the burning stable. Heat blasted her face as she approached. Smoke stung her eyes and caught in her throat. Red's terrified whinnies grew more frantic. Claire filled her bucket from the water trough and threw it at the flames, but the fire only seemed to laugh at her efforts. The smoke grew thicker, making her cough violently. "Mom!" Emily screamed from the yard. "Red needs help." Inside his stall, Red kicked harder against the door, the wood splintering under his powerful hooves. Claire could barely see through the smoke, but she heard the crash of breaking wood. Neighbors began arriving, carrying buckets and garden hoses. "Claire, get back!" Henry shouted, taking charge of the situation. A chain of people formed, passing buckets of water toward the stable. As dawn's first light crept over the horizon, the last flames sputtered out. Red stood trembling in the yard, his coat streaked with soot but otherwise unharmed. The stable's roof had partially collapsed, and the air still smelled of smoke and wet ash. Claire pulled Emily close, both of them watching Red. The horse's sides heaved with each breath, but his eyes remained bright and alert. Their neighbors gathered around, offering support and comfort. "We'll help you rebuild," Henry promised, placing a steady hand on Claire's shoulder. Claire looked at the charred remains of the stable, then at her daughter clinging to Red's neck. Her voice came out strong and clear. "Nobody's going to take him from us. Nobody." The morning sun cast long shadows across the charred remains of the stable. Claire stood with her arms wrapped around herself, taking in the destruction. The acrid smell of burned wood and hay still hung in the air, making her eyes water. Or maybe those were tears she was fighting back. Emily stood quietly beside Red, her small hand steady as she stroked his velvet nose. The horse's muscles still trembled, but his presence next to Emily remained gentle, protective. Claire watched as her daughter pressed her forehead against Red's neck, whispering words too soft to hear. "We'll fix it," Claire said, more to herself than anyone else. "We'll make it right." At Daniel Brooks' office later that morning, Claire's hand shook as she described the fire. The lawyer's usually calm demeanor shifted to concern as she spoke. "This wasn't an accident," Claire said firmly. "The fire started right after Hastings showed up making threats. That can't be a coincidence." Daniel leaned forward in his chair. "If we could prove Hastings was behind this, it would change everything, not just for keeping Red, but possibly bringing criminal charges." He tapped his pen thoughtfully against his desk. "Have you looked into his background? His treatment of other animals?" "No, but I will now." That evening, Claire spread old newspapers across her kitchen table. The lamp cast a warm glow as she flipped through yellowed pages. Her finger traced down columns of text until something caught her eye. "Local business owner faces questions about racehorse deaths," she read aloud. Another headline from 3 years ago. "Stable workers alleged neglect at Hastings Farm." Claire's jaw tightened as she read account after account. Horses pushed too hard, injuries ignored, animals disposed of when they stopped being profitable. She stacked the damning articles carefully, her hands steady now with purpose rather than fear. The kitchen clock ticked steadily as she organized the clippings. Through the window, she could see Red in his temporary shelter, Emily sitting nearby with her sketchbook. The sight of them together strengthened her resolve. This fight was about more than just keeping a horse. It was about standing up to a bully who had hurt too many animals for too long. Claire pulled up to Henry Lewis's modest ranch, gravel crunching under her tires. The morning air was crisp, and horses nickered softly in their paddocks. Henry was already outside, fixing a fence post with weathered hands. "Morning, Claire," he called out, setting down his tools. "How's Red doing after that awful business?" "He's shaken, but okay." Claire wrapped her arms around herself. "Henry, I need to ask you about Robert Hastings." Henry's face darkened. He gestured toward a wooden bench near the stable. "Sit down. There's something you should know." They settled on the bench, and Henry spoke in a low voice. Back when Hastings was big in racing, there were rumors, nasty ones, about how he'd do anything to win, including doping his horses. Claire leaned forward. "Can anyone prove it?" "Jack Warren might." Henry rubbed his chin. "Used to ride for Hastings. These days he keeps to himself. Runs that little diner off Route 7. If anyone knows the truth, it's Jack." Claire found the diner easily enough, a worn building with peeling paint and a flickering open sign. Inside, Jack Warren sat alone at the counter, a cup of coffee growing cold in front of him. He was smaller than she'd imagined, with deep lines around his eyes that spoke of hard years. When Claire mentioned Hastings' name, Jack's shoulders tensed. "I don't talk about those days," he said quietly. "Please," Claire said. He's trying to take my horse. The same thing might happen to Red that happened to Firestorm." Jack's head snapped up. "How do you know about Firestorm?" "I don't, not really. But I need to know." Jack stared into his coffee cup for a long moment. "Firestorm was Red's sire, fastest horse I ever rode. But Hastings," his voice cracked, "he made me race him when he was injured. Pushed that beautiful animal until he just collapsed. Right there on the track." Claire's heart ached as Jack continued, describing years of abuse and corruption. When she asked him to sign a statement, his hand shook, but he took the pen. "I should have spoken up years ago," he said, signing his name. "Maybe this will help make things right." That evening, Claire drove home with Jack's statement tucked safely in her purse. She found Emily in the stable, brushing Red's coat with slow, careful strokes. The horse's eyes were half closed, peaceful under Emily's gentle touch. Claire watched them, feeling a surge of determination. Her daughter's soft humming filled the stable, a quiet reminder of everything they were fighting for. The iron gates of Hastings' estate loomed before Claire, ornate and imposing. Her hands trembled slightly as she clutched Jack Warren's signed testimony, but her jaw was set with determination. She pressed the intercom button. "I need to speak with Mr. Hastings," she said firmly. Minutes later, Robert Hastings strolled down his curved driveway, wearing an expensive suit and a condescending smile. "Mrs. Martin, what an unexpected surprise." Claire held out the papers. "I have proof of your history with horses, Mr. Hastings. Jack Warren told me everything about Firestorm and the others." Hastings barely glanced at the papers before chuckling. "A desperate woman clutching at straws. A washed-up jockey's word against mine." He stepped closer, his voice dropping. "Go ahead, take legal action. See how far that gets you." Back at the farm, Claire's fingers shook as she dialed Sarah Johnson's number. Emily sat cross-legged near Red's stall, drawing in her notebook while the horse dozed nearby. "Sarah? I have something you need to see," Claire said, explaining Jack's testimony. "People need to know what kind of man Robert Hastings really is." "Send me everything you have," Sarah replied eagerly. "I'll start digging right away. A story like this could make waves." That evening, Claire's phone rang. "Claire, it's Daniel." Her lawyer's voice was heavy. "I just heard from Sarah. Her editor killed the story. Pressure from above. Without official records, we're in a tough spot legally." Claire sank into her kitchen chair, watching through the window as Emily led Red to his evening feed. "I understand, Daniel. But I'm not giving up. There has to be more evidence out there." "Just be careful, Claire. Hastings has friends in high places." Claire hung up the phone, her shoulders tight with tension, but her resolve unchanged. She wouldn't let Hastings win, not when Red and Emily's happiness hung in the balance. Claire sat cross-legged on the living room floor, surrounded by John's belongings. Her fingers traced the worn edges of his favorite hammer, memories flooding back of him, fixing the porch steps last spring. Each item she placed in the sell pile felt like saying goodbye all over again. "It's what he'd want," she whispered, wiping her eyes, "to keep Red safe." Through the window, she could see Emily in the yard, leading Red in slow circles. The horse's coat, once dull and patchy, now showed hints of its original gleam. His steps were steadier, head held higher than it had been in months. By mid-afternoon, pickup trucks started arriving at the farm. Tom Baker from down the road brought lumber. The Peterson sisters carried boxes of nails and tools. Even old Mrs. Jenkins hobbled up with fresh-baked cookies and coffee for the workers. "We saw what happened to your stable," Tom said, already rolling up his sleeves. "Thought you could use some help." Claire's eyes welled up as more neighbors appeared, carrying supplies and offering support. They worked together, clearing debris and starting repairs on the burned section of the stable. As she handed out cups of water to the volunteers, Claire overheard Sarah Miller talking to her husband. "I was at the diner yesterday," Sarah whispered. "Hastings was there with some men, talking about making a bigger move to get what he wants. Sounded serious." Claire's stomach tightened, but she kept her expression neutral as Emily walked past with Red's brush. Her daughter didn't need more worry. Evening brought dark clouds rolling in from the west. The neighbors had gone home, leaving behind a partially repaired stable and promises to return tomorrow. Claire stood in the yard, watching the approaching storm. The wind picked up, carrying the scent of rain. Inside the stable, Emily had fallen asleep on a fresh hay bale beside Red's stall. The horse stood guard, his gentle breathing mixing with the distant rumble of thunder. Claire watched them both, her heart full of love and fear for what tomorrow might bring. Claire sat in Daniel Brooks' modest office, clutching her manila folder of evidence. Sunlight streamed through dusty blinds as Daniel leaned forward in his chair. "Margaret Olson is the best in animal abuse cases," he said, sliding a business card across his desk. "She's won against bigger opponents than Hastings. If anyone can help us, it's her." Claire picked up the card, studying the elegant script. "How far is her office?" 3 hours north in Cedar Grove. I've already called her. She'll see you tomorrow morning." At home, Emily sat at the kitchen table. Her colored pencils scattered across the surface. She hummed softly while drawing Red, his mane flowing in careful strokes of orange and brown. Claire watched her daughter's focused expression, grateful for these peaceful moments. "That's beautiful, sweetheart," Claire said, gathering papers at the table. "Would you like to make some more drawings for Ms. Olson? She's going to help us keep Red safe." Emily nodded, already reaching for a fresh sheet of paper. Claire spread her evidence across the table. Jack Warren's signed testimony, photographs showing Red's recovery, and veterinary records documenting his improved health. She carefully arranged everything in chronological order, adding Emily's drawings as a personal touch. Outside, dark clouds began rolling in from the west. Red nickered softly in his stable, and Emily glanced up at the sound, her pencil pausing mid-stroke. Later that evening, after tucking Emily into bed, Claire checked the weather report on her phone. The screen glowed with severe storm warnings for the following day. Heavy rain, strong winds, and possible flooding were predicted along her route. She stood at the kitchen window, watching lightning flicker in the distance. The trip would be risky, but waiting wasn't an option. Margaret Olson's expertise could make the difference between keeping Red and losing him to Hastings. Claire packed her briefcase and laid out her clothes for the morning, determination outweighing her concerns about the weather. This meeting had to happen, storm or no storm. Claire zipped up her overnight bag and double-checked the manila folder filled with documents and Emily's drawings. The evening sun cast long shadows across the kitchen floor as Mrs. Turner, their silver-haired neighbor, settled into the armchair with her knitting. "We'll be just fine," Mrs. Turner assured her, needles clicking softly. "Emily and I will have a nice, quiet evening." Claire knelt beside Emily, who sat cross-legged on the floor. "I'll be back tomorrow, sweetheart. Be good for Mrs. Turner, okay?" Emily clutched her wooden horse, the one John had carved, and nodded without looking up. Claire pressed a kiss to her daughter's forehead, trying to ignore the knot in her stomach. The drive started peacefully enough. Claire followed the winding country roads as dusk settled in, her headlights cutting through the growing darkness. But an hour into her journey, the weather turned. Fat raindrops splattered against her windshield, forcing her to slow down. The rain grew heavier, drumming against the car roof. Claire gripped the steering wheel tighter, squinting through the blur of her wipers. Water pooled on the road, making the yellow lines hard to see. "Just a few more hours," she whispered to herself. determined to reach Margaret Olson's office. She thought of Emily, of Red, of everything they stood to lose. She had to keep going. Suddenly, her tires hit a slick patch of mud. The car jerked sideways, tires spinning uselessly. Claire's heart jumped to her throat as she pumped the brakes. But the car wouldn't respond, sliding instead toward the steep shoulder of the road. Time seemed to slow as the car tipped over the edge. Claire saw tree branches rushing toward her through the windshield. There was a sickening crunch of metal, a sharp pain in her forehead, and then darkness swallowed everything. Back at the farm, Red paced in his stall. His hooves struck the wooden floor with sharp, anxious thuds. Outside, thunder rolled across the sky as lightning illuminated the countryside in brief, brilliant flashes. In her bedroom, Emily sat on the window seat, pressing her palm against the cool glass. Her wooden horse lay in her lap as she stared into the stormy night, waiting for her mother's headlights to appear on the driveway. Red's urgent whinnying echoed from the stable. He reared up, front hooves pawing at his stall door, as another flash of lightning split the sky. The storm raged through the night, rain pelting against the farmhouse windows. In his stall, Red paced restlessly, his hooves clicking against the wooden floor. Something was wrong. He could feel it. With each passing hour, his agitation grew until he couldn't stand it anymore. Gathering his strength, he kicked at the loose gate repeatedly until it burst open with a loud crack. Emily jolted awake at the sound. Running to her window, she saw Red's dark shape moving through the rain. "Red!" she cried out, racing downstairs and out the door in her pajamas. "Red, come back!" Mrs. Turner hurried after her, wrapping a quilt around Emily's shoulders. "Child, you'll catch your death. Come inside. We'll look for him when it's light." "But Red—" Emily's voice trembled as the horse disappeared into the darkness. Through the stormy night, Red pressed forward, driven by an instinct he couldn't explain. His hooves splashed through puddles and muddy streams as he followed the road Claire had taken. The rain matted his coat, but he kept going, crossing fields and jumping fallen branches. As the sun began to rise, painting the sky in pale pinks and grays, Red reached a bend in the road. There, partially hidden in a shallow ravine, was Claire's car. Its front end was crumpled against a tree, and Claire lay slumped over the steering wheel. Red circled the car, whinnying loudly. When Claire didn't respond, he let out another cry, even louder than before. Again and again he called out, his voice echoing through the misty morning air. A blue pickup truck slowed to a stop on the road above. "Hello?" called out a man's voice. "Is someone down there?" Red whinnied again, drawing the motorist's attention to the crashed car. The man scrambled down the muddy slope, phone already in hand. "Hello, 911. There's been an accident." The man peered through the car window at Claire's still form while speaking to the dispatcher. Red stayed close, gently nuzzling Claire's arm through the broken window. His warm breath fogged the glass as he kept watch, refusing to leave her side even when the ambulance sirens wailed in the distance. The paramedics worked quickly, carefully extracting Claire from the wreckage. Red stood quietly nearby, watching as they loaded her into the ambulance. Only when the vehicle disappeared down the road, lights flashing, did he finally lower his head, his mission complete. The hospital corridors buzzed with urgent activity as doctors wheeled Claire into surgery. Her face was pale, blood matting her hair where she'd struck the steering wheel. The doctors spoke in hushed, serious tones about internal bleeding and possible organ damage. Miles away at the neighbor's house, Emily sat curled up in a corner of Mrs. Turner's living room. Her small wooden horse was clutched tightly to her chest, her eyes fixed on nothing in particular. The morning light filtered through lace curtains, but Emily remained lost in her own world. "Sweetheart, please try to eat something," Mrs. Turner coaxed, setting a plate of scrambled eggs on the coffee table. "Your mama would want you to keep up your strength." Emily didn't respond, didn't even blink. The food grew cold, untouched. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the Martin property when a black SUV pulled into the driveway, followed by a horse trailer. Robert Hastings stepped out, his expensive shoes sinking slightly in the mud. Two burly men flanked him as he strode toward the stable. "I'm here for the horse," Hastings announced to the gathered neighbors. "Given Mrs. Martin's condition, it's clear she can't properly care for him. I'm taking Red for safekeeping." "You have no right," called out one of the neighbors, but Hastings merely smiled, producing a stack of official-looking papers. Red sensed the tension, his ears pinned back as Hastings' men approached with a lead rope. He reared up, hooves striking the air, but they were prepared. Despite his resistance, they forced him toward the trailer, using harsh commands and tight restraints. From Mrs. Turner's window, Emily watched silently as they loaded Red into the trailer. Her small hands pressed against the glass, trembling. When Red let out a distressed whinny, she flinched, but made no sound. The trailer's door slammed shut with a metallic clang. Hastings climbed back into his SUV, and the vehicles pulled away, taking Red with them. The neighbors stood helplessly in the yard, watching them disappear down the road. As evening settled over the farm, Emily retreated to her bedroom. Mrs. Turner knocked softly on the door. "Emily, honey, I've made some soup." There was no response. Inside, Emily lay curled on her bed, still clutching the wooden horse. Her eyes were fixed on the window, where she could see Red's empty stall in the gathering darkness. The usual sounds of his movements, his gentle nickering, all were replaced by a heavy silence that seemed to fill every corner of the house. Mrs. Turner sighed, setting the bowl of soup outside Emily's door. The old farmhouse creaked around them, as if it too felt the weight of Red's absence. Claire's eyes fluttered open to the harsh fluorescent lights of the hospital room. Her whole body ached, and the steady beeping of monitors filled her ears. As her vision cleared, she saw Emily sitting in a chair beside her bed, clutching the wooden horse her father had carved. Something was wrong. Emily's shoulders were hunched, her face drawn and pale. "Emily, sweetie?" Claire's voice came out raspy. She tried to reach for her daughter, but the movement sent sharp pain through her ribs. Emily didn't respond or look up, just held the horse tighter. Mrs. Turner appeared in the doorway, her usually cheerful face creased with worry. "Claire, thank goodness you're awake. The doctors say you're going to be fine. Just need some rest." But Claire couldn't take her eyes off Emily. "What happened? What's wrong with Emily?" Mrs. Turner wrung her hands, tears welling in her eyes. "I'm so sorry, Claire. It's about Red. Mr. Hastings came to the farm yesterday with two men. They took him away. Said it was for safekeeping while you were injured. We tried to stop them, but they had papers." Claire's heart dropped like a stone. "No," she whispered, tears streaming down her face. "No, they can't do this." She reached for Emily again, ignoring the pain. This time, her daughter leaned into her touch, silent tears falling onto the wooden horse. "It's my fault," Claire sobbed. "I shouldn't have left. I should have waited." From her hospital bed, Claire fumbled for her phone on the bedside table. Her hands shook as she dialed Daniel Brooks's number. "Daniel, it's Claire Martin. Hastings took Red while I was unconscious. He can't get away with this." Her voice grew stronger with each word. "We need to stop him now." After speaking with Daniel, she called Sarah Johnson. "Sarah, I need your help. This isn't just about Red anymore. It's about stopping a man who thinks he can take whatever he wants." As Claire spoke, Emily lifted her head slightly, watching her mother's face. For the first time since Red's abduction, a tiny glimmer appeared in her eyes. Claire reached out and squeezed her daughter's hand, determination replacing her tears. "We're getting him back, Emily," she promised. "We're getting Red back." Claire winced as she stepped through her front door, her arms secured in a tight sling. The quiet house felt wrong, like all the joy had been sucked out of it. Emily shuffled past her, head down, clutching the wooden horse to her chest. Without a word, her daughter disappeared into her bedroom, closing the door with a soft click. "Emily, honey," Claire called out, but only silence answered. Her heart ached more than her injuries. That afternoon, the kitchen table became command central. Daniel Brooks spread legal documents across its worn surface, while Sarah Johnson flipped through her reporter's notebook. Coffee cups sat untouched as they worked. "Look at this," Daniel said, pointing to a dusty legal document. "According to county law, if livestock or horses are abandoned and then cared for by another party for more than 90 days without any formal claim from the original owner, ownership rights can transfer to the caregiver." Sarah leaned forward, her eyes bright. "And how long was Red with you before Hastings showed up?" "Almost 3 months after John—" Claire's voice caught. She cleared her throat. "And Hastings didn't make any formal claim until recently." "This could be our angle," Daniel said, circling the relevant passage. "Combined with the documented neglect before John purchased Red, we might have something solid." Sarah nodded eagerly. "The community's already buzzing about this. People are angry about what Hastings did while you were in the hospital. If we can get them to speak up about his reputation, about what they've witnessed over the years." Claire started writing everything down. Dates, events, witnesses. Her hand trembled slightly, but her writing was clear and determined. Each detail mattered, each piece of evidence bringing them closer to getting Red back. "We'll need statements," Daniel said, making his own notes. "From Henry Lewis, Jack Warren, anyone who can verify Red's condition before and after John bought him." "I can help gather those," Sarah offered. "People trust me, and they're more likely to open up to a familiar face." As the evening wore on, Claire felt something she hadn't experienced since waking up in the hospital: hope. It wasn't much, just a tiny spark, but it was there. Maybe, just maybe, they could bring Red home. Sarah Johnson adjusted her camera, focusing on Mrs. Henderson, one of the closest neighbors to the Martin farm. The morning sun cast long shadows across the front yard as the elderly woman spoke with conviction. "I saw those men drag that poor horse into the trailer," Mrs. Henderson said, her voice trembling with anger. "Red was fighting them, something fierce. It wasn't right, not right at all." From the wooden porch steps, Emily sat quietly, her small fingers running over the smooth surface of her father's carved horse. Claire stood nearby, her arm still in a sling, watching as more neighbors arrived to share their stories. "The night of the fire, I saw 2 men running from the property," Mr. Thompson, the dairy farmer from down the road, testified. "Next thing we knew, flames were shooting up from Claire's stable. That wasn't no accident." Sarah moved through the gathered crowd, capturing their accounts one by one. Each testimony painted a clearer picture of Hastings' intimidation tactics and the community's growing resistance to his bullying. Around noon, Claire's phone rang. It was Daniel Brooks, his voice excited. "Claire, you won't believe this. The county clerk just called me back about those ownership records." Claire pressed the phone closer to her ear. "What did they say?" The clerk admitted there were files that had been, shall we say, misplaced. They show Hastings never properly transferred ownership of Red. Not when he first acquired him, and not when John bought him. Legally speaking, there's no paper trail showing Hastings ever owned Red in the first place. Claire's hand trembled as she gripped the phone. So what does that mean for us? It means Hastings has no legal claim to Red. Combined with the abandonment clause we found yesterday, this could be exactly what we need. Later that afternoon, Sarah set up her laptop on Claire's kitchen table. I want you to see what I've put together, she said, clicking play on the video. The screen showed Red's transformation under the Martins' care, from a sickly horse to a stronger, healthier animal. Interviews with neighbors detailed the special bond between Red and Emily. Then came the darker footage, the charred remains of the stable, testimonies about the suspicious fire, and finally, accounts of Red being forcibly taken. I've included Jack Warren's testimony about Hastings' history of animal abuse, Sarah explained, and the clerk's admission about the hidden files. Claire, this isn't just about Red anymore. This exposes years of Hastings' misconduct. Claire watched the screen, tears welling in her eyes. The story was powerful, showing not just their struggle, but the whole community's stand against injustice. Emily crept closer, her eyes fixed on the images of Red. When do we release it? Claire asked, wiping her eyes. Tomorrow morning, Sarah replied. Every local news outlet will have it, and I've got contacts at the state level interested too. Hastings won't be able to hide from this. The town square buzzed with activity as neighbors gathered under the morning sun. Sarah Johnson adjusted her cameras while Claire stood at the makeshift podium, her arm still in a sling, but her spine straight with determination. Emily sat in the front row between Mrs. Turner and Henry Lewis, clutching her wooden horse. The crowd parted as Robert Hastings strode in, his expensive suit standing out among the casual farm clothes of the townspeople. A smirk played across his face as he took his place near the front. Thank you all for coming, Claire began, her voice steady. 3 years ago, my late husband John saw something special in a sick horse named Red. Today, I'm here to show you what Mr. Hastings tried to hide. Sarah started playing the footage on a large screen. Images of the burned stable filled the air, followed by interviews with neighbors describing the suspicious figures seen that night. Hastings' smirk faltered slightly. Claire held up a manila folder. These are the county records Mr. Hastings tried to bury. They prove he never legally owned Red after abandoning him. She turned to face Hastings directly. And this is Jack Warren's sworn testimony about how you treated your horses. The crowd murmured as Sarah played clips of Jack Warren describing Hastings' cruelty. He worked Firestorm until the horse collapsed, Jack's voice rang out. Then he did the same to Red before dumping him. More neighbors stepped forward, sharing their accounts of the barn fire and Hastings' intimidation tactics. The crowd grew angry, voices rising in accusation. "Horse killer!" someone shouted. "Give Red back!" called another. Hastings' confident facade cracked. He turned to leave, but found his path blocked by determined townspeople. Their faces showed years of pent-up resentment toward his bullying ways. Claire stepped down from the podium, facing him. "You can't hide anymore, Mr. Hastings. These people know the truth now." She gestured to Sarah's cameras. "And so does everyone watching this live broadcast." Hastings' face reddened as he realized the extent of his exposure. He tried to push through the crowd, but they held firm, demanding justice for Red and the Martins. "This isn't over," he sputtered, but his voice lacked its usual authority. "You're right," Claire replied calmly. "It won't be over until Red comes home where he belongs." Sarah stepped forward, camera steady. "Every moment of this is being recorded, Mr. Hastings. The whole county is watching." Hastings retreated to his car, followed by the angry murmurs of the crowd. As he drove away, the townspeople gathered around Claire, offering their continued support in her fight for Red. The small courthouse buzzed with tension as Claire sat beside Daniel Brooks, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. Every wooden bench behind them was filled with neighbors, their supportive presence giving her strength. Emily wasn't present. Claire had decided the courtroom would be too overwhelming for her daughter. Robert Hastings swept in with his expensive lawyer, both wearing tailored suits that probably cost more than Claire's monthly expenses. The lawyer, Mr. Peterson, carried a leather briefcase stuffed with papers. Judge Martha Wilson called the court to order, her stern gaze taking in both parties. "This case concerns the ownership of one horse known as Red," she began. Mr. Peterson stood first, his voice smooth and practiced. "Your Honor, while Mrs. Martin may have emotional attachments to this animal, she lacks the financial stability to provide proper care. Mr. Hastings has extensive resources and experience with horses." Daniel rose calmly, adjusting his glasses. "Your Honor, I direct your attention to Exhibit A. County records showing Mr. Hastings never formally claimed ownership of Red after the initial auction. According to local statute 47.3, an abandoned animals care provider can claim legal ownership after 3 months of continuous care. The Martins have cared for Red for 3 years. The judge reviewed the documents carefully, while Sarah Johnson's footage played on a small screen. The images showed Red's transformation from a sickly horse to a healthier, spirited animal under Claire's care. Neighbors testified about Claire's dedication, describing how she'd taken extra jobs to afford Red's feed. "And what about the stable fire?" Judge Wilson asked, looking up from her notes. Sarah stepped forward, presenting her investigative findings. "Your Honor, multiple witnesses reported suspicious activity that night. Additionally, I've uncovered a pattern of similar incidents at other properties that refused Mr. Hastings' demands." Hastings shifted uncomfortably in his seat as more evidence mounted. His lawyer attempted to object several times, but the judge overruled him, carefully examining each piece of evidence. Claire's heart pounded as Judge Wilson began delivering her verdict. "This court finds substantial evidence that Mrs. Martin has provided consistent, loving care for Red, despite significant financial hardship. Furthermore, Mr. Hastings' failure to claim ownership for 3 years, combined with the concerning pattern of intimidation tactics, leads this court to rule in favor of Mrs. Martin. Full legal ownership of Red is hereby granted to Claire Martin." The courtroom erupted in cheers. Neighbors hugged Claire while Hastings stormed out, his face red with anger. Daniel smiled warmly, gathering their papers, while Sarah squeezed Claire's hand in congratulation. The morning sun painted golden streaks across the farmyard as Claire stood with her neighbors, watching the livestock trailer rumble up the dirt driveway. Her heart pounded against her ribs. Emily clutched her wooden horse, standing close to her mother's side, her eyes fixed on the trailer. The officials worked efficiently, lowering the ramp with metallic clanks that echoed through the quiet morning. Inside, they could hear the familiar sound of hooves shifting against metal flooring. Claire squeezed Emily's shoulder gently. Red emerged into the sunlight, his copper coat dulled from his time away, but his head held high. He paused at the top of the ramp, nostrils flaring as he took in the familiar sense of home. Then, as if remembering everything at once, he let out a loud, clear neigh that rang across the farmyard. Emily's grip on her wooden horse loosened slightly. Red's ears pricked forward at the sight of her, and he descended the ramp with careful steps. "Go on," Claire whispered to Emily, giving her a gentle nudge. "He's waiting for you." Emily moved forward slowly, her movements cautious but deliberate. The neighbors watched in respectful silence as she approached Red, her small hand extending toward his nose. Red lowered his head, meeting her halfway, and nuzzled her palm with the same gentleness he'd always shown her. A smile, the first real smile since the fire, spread across Emily's face. She wrapped her arms around Red's neck, burying her face in his mane. The horse stood perfectly still, as if understanding the importance of this moment. Tears streamed down Claire's cheeks as she watched her daughter reconnect with Red. The neighbors broke into spontaneous applause, their joy echoing across the farm. Claire walked over and wrapped her arms around both Emily and Red, feeling the horse's steady breathing and her daughter's small frame against her. As the morning wore on, neighbors began to drift away, leaving the family to settle back into their rhythm. Claire stood in the doorway of the newly repaired stable, watching Emily methodically brush Red's mane. The afternoon light filtered through the barn windows, catching the dust motes that danced around them. Emily hummed softly, a tune John used to sing as she worked, while Red stood contentedly, occasionally turning his head to watch her. Claire leaned against the doorframe, overwhelmed by gratitude. In bringing Red home that day 3 years ago, John had given them more than just a horse. He'd given them hope, strength, and healing when they needed it most. Claire sat at her weathered kitchen table, surrounded by envelopes and cards from neighbors and strangers alike. Sunlight streamed through the window, warming the scattered papers before her. Her fingers traced over heartfelt messages of support and encouragement. When she opened a plain white envelope, her breath caught. Inside was a check with enough zeros to rebuild the entire barn, signed simply, "A Friend." Through the open window, Emily's clear laugh drifted in on the morning breeze. Claire looked out to see her daughter leading Red in gentle circles, her hand resting easily on his bridle. The horse moved with careful steps, matching his pace to Emily's. It was the first time Claire had heard her daughter laugh so freely since John's passing. The sight sparked something in Claire's mind. She grabbed a fresh piece of paper and began writing, her pen moving quickly as the idea took shape. "Red's Refuge," she wrote at the top, underlining it with purpose. Below, she sketched out plans for animal stalls, exercise areas, and rehabilitation spaces. "Emily," she called out the window, "come see this, sweetheart." Emily came inside, her cheeks flushed from the morning sun. When Claire explained her vision for helping other animals like Red, Emily's eyes lit up. She ran to get her drawing supplies and settled at the table beside her mother. "We could make a sign," Emily said softly, already sketching. Her pencil moved across the paper, creating a simple but touching design, a horse's silhouette with gentle eyes, surrounded by the sanctuary's name. As evening approached, Claire gathered with their neighbors in the yard. Red stood nearby, his coat gleaming in the golden light. Claire held up Emily's drawing and shared her vision for the sanctuary. The response was immediate and heartwarming. "I can help with the electrical work," offered Mr. Thompson, raising his hand. "Count me in for the framing," added another neighbor. Mrs. Turner stepped forward, smiling. "I'll coordinate volunteers and supplies." Standing there, surrounded by support and goodwill, Claire felt tears prick her eyes. Red nickered softly behind her, as if adding his own approval to the plan. The morning sun cast long shadows across the Martin farm as pickup trucks rumbled up the driveway, loaded with lumber, tools, and building supplies. Henry Lewis stood near the old barn's foundation, his weathered hands spreading out detailed blueprints on a makeshift table. "We'll put the recovery stalls here," he explained to Claire, pointing at the drawings. "Extra wide, with soft flooring for injured animals." Claire nodded, watching as neighbors unloaded materials and organized work teams. The sight of so many people coming together made her throat tight with emotion. Emily darted between the workers, carrying armfuls of blankets and supplies to a storage tent. Red followed her closely, his presence steady and watchful. "The feed room needs to be bigger," Emily said quietly, pausing beside Henry, "for different types of food." Henry smiled and adjusted his plans, taking her suggestion seriously. By midday, the framework of the new barn began taking shape against the blue sky. Sarah Johnson arrived with her camera crew, capturing the community's effort. She found Claire organizing supplies with some volunteers. "Tell me about your vision for Red's Refuge," Sarah said, holding up her microphone. Claire wiped her hands on her jeans. "Every animal deserves a second chance, just like Red got. This sanctuary will be a place of healing and hope." The camera panned to where Emily sat in the grass with Red and several neighborhood children. They were taking turns brushing the horse's coat while Emily explained how to be gentle. Red stood perfectly still, seeming to understand the importance of his role with the young visitors. "He's a real hero," one little boy said, patting Red's nose. "My mom told me how he saved Ms. Martin." Sarah filmed as Emily nodded, her usual silence giving way to quiet pride as she demonstrated proper grooming techniques to her young audience. As evening approached, the barn's basic structure stood complete. Workers began packing up their tools, satisfied with the day's progress. Claire stood between Emily and Red, gazing at the new building. The setting sun painted the fresh lumber in warm golden tones. Emily leaned against her mother's side, while Red gently nudged Claire's shoulder with his nose. She reached up to stroke his neck, overwhelmed by how far they'd come. The new barn represented more than just a building. It was a symbol of their community's kindness and the power of second chances. "It's beautiful, Mom," Emily whispered, watching the last rays of sunlight glint off the barn's frame.
Claire wrapped her arm around her daughter's shoulders, feeling a deep sense of rightness settle in her heart. They were building something that would help others, just as others had helped them.
The autumn breeze carried the scent of fresh hay as people gathered around the newly built barn. Colorful balloons and ribbons decorated the entrance, and a large sign reading "Red's Refuge" hung proudly above the door. Claire stood at a small podium, her hands trembling slightly as she looked out at the familiar faces of her neighbors. "2 months ago, I thought I'd lost everything," she began, her voice steady despite her emotions. "But thanks to Red, and to all of you, we found something greater than ourselves." Emily led Red in a gentle walk around the paddock, her small hand resting confidently on his lead rope. The horse moved with grace, his coat gleaming in the sunlight, a far cry from the sickly animal John had rescued years ago. Neighbors applauded as they passed, many wiping away tears. "My husband John believed in second chances," Claire continued. "This sanctuary is dedicated to his memory and to every animal that deserves another chance at life." As the ribbon was cut, cheers erupted from the crowd. Emily beamed with pride as she patted Red's neck, and for the first time in months her smile reached her eyes. Later that afternoon, a truck pulled up carrying their first rescue, a thin, scraggly goat with matted fur. Emily carefully approached the nervous animal, speaking in soft tones, just as she did with Red. The horse watched from his paddock, ears forward with interest. "Welcome to your new home," Emily whispered to the goat, offering it fresh hay. Claire sorted through a stack of letters on the porch, finding a heartfelt note from Daniel Brooks and Sarah Johnson. Enclosed were checks from readers touched by their story, each donation meant to support the sanctuary's mission. As the sun began to set, Claire and Emily sat on the porch steps, watching their new world unfold. Red wandered over, gently nudging Emily's shoulder. She began to hum softly, the same tune John used to whistle while doing his evening chores. Claire wrapped an arm around her daughter, taking in the peaceful scene before them. The new barn stood proud against the orange sky, while the rescued goat dozed contentedly in its pen. Red remained close by, his presence a reminder of everything they'd overcome together. The golden light of dusk bathed the sanctuary in warm hues, and Claire felt a deep sense of peace settle over the farm. In Red's steady gaze, she saw not just their past struggles, but the promise of new beginnings for every animal that would find refuge here. If you enjoyed the story of Emily, I handpicked this next story that you will enjoy. Please don't miss this one. Click here to watch it.